control so I can share my screen.
I need to resume the recording here. And you'll be emailed a email of the recording in case you want to rewatch it or in case anybody who's not here today wants to watch it later. So today we're talking about the state of Nebraska's forests, and leading that discussion is Nebraska State Forester John Erixson. John was first appointed Nebraska State Forester in 2017. And this past November, he was reappointed to his second 5-year term in the position. So since 2017, John has helped guide Nebraska's response to the emerald ash borer invasion, as well as to the increasing number of wildfires that we've seen in recent months and years. John's a native of Nebraska. He holds a bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Idaho. And before his time with the Nebraska Forest Service, John worked for more than 20 years managing natural resources in Idaho for a private consulting firm. So we welcome John today and thank him for being with us to bring us up to speed on the state of Nebraska's forests.
Awesome. Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate the introduction and good morning to everybody out in the western part of the state or country, and good afternoon to all of you on the eastern side here. My name is John Erixson. I'm the state forester, and what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about the agency. So you know a little bit about what Nebraska Forest Service is and how we fit into the management of our forests. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about our forests themselves and some of the unique things we have here in Nebraska around our forests, and then look at a few of the challenges that we have out in front of us. And Michelle mentioned the wildfire situation we have, emerald ash borer. Those are certainly a few of the problems, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So first, starting out with the agency, Nebraska Forest Service is a state agency administratively housed within the Institute of Agricultural and Natural Resources here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. We're one of 5 state forestry agencies that are within our land grant universities. And so it's a little bit unique, but around our mission here at the Nebraska Forest Service, our mission is to enrich lives of all Nebraskans. And we do that by protecting, restoring, and utilizing Nebraska's tree and forest sources. And the difference between trees and forest resources we'll get into a little bit later, but you know, here on East Campus, we live in a community forest, and there are other situations where we have trees that aren't technically forests, but they are trees that are contributing to the benefits of all Nebraskans. And we do that through our mission, through our vision, and by inspiring and assisting others to create and sustain healthy and productive forests. And our core values within the Nebraska Forest Service are integrity in all interactions, responsible and sustainable stewardship, and outstanding service to Nebraskans. So that really becomes our guiding principles about how we implement our forestry actions across the state, and how we help landowners, communities, homeowners, and all Nebraskans in their forestry needs. We have a few guiding principles and mandates that we follow. We first start with some different documents that we put together, and really these are all driven by our legislative mandates. Within our federal system, there are mandates that the states have these different programs, and the 4 programs are rural forestry assistance, urban and community forestry assistance, forest health assistance, and rural fire protection and control. And that's also in our state guided legislation that defines what the Nebraska Forest Service does. But within our agency, we have a forest action plan that we put together, which guides our activities, and it looks like this. It's available on our website. It starts out with looking at our priority landscapes in Nebraska, and those priority landscapes really are driven more by the geographic areas than they are necessarily any other feature. And the Pine Ridge is one of those areas. The Niobrara system is one of those areas. The Elkhorn is one. The Loup River system is one. The Republican River is one. And as we put our forest action plan together, we started out by asking our folks that work out in that area, you know, what are the priorities for your forest in that area? And they came up with the issues and the priorities in those areas, and even helped define what the future condition might look like in that area. Then we reached out to our partners that are out in that area and asked them to provide feedback for those thoughts that were put together, and then reached out to the public to further define what the goals and objectives should be for those areas. And in our forest action plan, that really becomes the guiding principles that we strive for as we look forward. We also looked at our programs and said, you know, we recognize that in Nebraska, our community forests are as important to us as our other forests are. And that isn't a requirement within our forest action plan, but we started looking into each of our programs and how these programs tie back to the forest resources across the state. So the forest action plan becomes our overarching document. That's a 10-year plan. It's reviewed on a 5-year cycle and then rewritten every 10 years. So within our programs, our rural forestry program, our rural foresters are here to enhance the forest resource, help landowners with the forest health issues that they run in, maintain the productivity of our Nebraska forest resources, and improve diversity and resiliency of those forest lands. So they're primarily working out in the rural forest, rural areas of Nebraska. They provide technical assistance. They provide financial assistance for those landowners when it's available. And this could include anything from doing forest management to conservation tree planting to timber harvesting, or just fuels reductions to make their forest more resilient in case of a wildfire. Our community forestry program, our foresters provide technical and financial assistance to support and promote the health and productivity of our Nebraska's community green infrastructure, and again, improve the diversity and resiliency of all community forests for the future generations. Now on the picture here on the left, you can see a downtown area where there aren't any trees. And on the right, you see a community that has trees in their downtown area. In Nebraska, we have about 489,000 acres of community forests. And these forests add to the economic value. People spend more time in an area that's treed than they would in an area that's not treed when they're in a downtown area. They spend more time shopping and enjoying those areas. There's less heat that reaches the hard surfaces here, so those tend to last longer than areas that don't have that protection. There's health benefits associated with having green infrastructure in the community, and there's even research that shows there's less crime in areas that have forest settings or urban forest settings. So really an important program that we operate in. There's also our forest health group. Our forest health group promote the health and productivity of Nebraska Forest Resources, again, by providing technical assistance and helping people diagnose what the issues are, recognize if there's disease issues in our trees, or if there's other abiotic issues in those trees. You know, and here on the slide, we have in the lower left emerald ash borer. We know that that as emerald ash borer moves across the state, and if you look at the map, you can see confirmed locations of emerald ash borer, the ash trees are going to die, and we need to be thinking about what we do with those trees, and thinking about how we replace those trees as time goes on too. One thing that we've learned, maybe not as well as we should have over the years, is when Dutch elm disease came through in the 70s and wiped out most of the American elm trees that we had here in Nebraska, we thought, well, okay, let's plant ash trees, and ash trees do wonderful here in Nebraska, so let's do that. And a lot of those trees were replaced solely with ash trees, and that was an error on our part as we were looking at things. So as we look out ahead of us, we don't want to make that same mistake. As EAB moves across the state, we don't want to replace it all with maple trees and have a problem with the Asian longhorn beetle that's in the lower right corner of it, or we don't want to just put out walnut trees, because walnut twig beetle is present here in the state of Nebraska. So we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket. We want a diverse canopy as much as we can with the trees that grow. Our forest health folks also look out, what's our next issue that we can identify, if we can, that may show up here in Nebraska. In the northeast part of the country, the spotted lanternfly, which is in the upper left corner of this slide, is present. It is a defoliator that is out there, and it likes a lot of different tree species. So if we end up with that being moved here to Nebraska, and they have found one of the moths in Kansas, it was dead when they found it, so we don't think it's here. But if this shows up in Nebraska, what are we going to do about it, and what trees will it affect? So our forest health staff are constantly looking out into the future at what might be next. Our fire program is probably the most visible program that is out there, and their goal is to keep fires small, to reduce risk to lives and property. And that's pretty short and sweet, but that ultimately is what they're trying to do. And here in the last year and a half or so, our last year's fire season, so 2022 fire season, actually started in June of 21. And we had major fires throughout the year, throughout the winter, across the state. And that fire season didn't end till November of this year. So our fire season is getting longer as we have drought situations that happen. And what can we do as an agency to help reduce those wildfires, and to help our volunteer fire departments respond to fires, to keep them small and allow people to go home at night and have their property safe? So a couple of the things we have here in Nebraska is we have a single engine air tanker program, and that's an aircraft that comes on contract with the state of Nebraska, and it stays over a period of time and responds to wildfires. We have 5 bases here, permanent bases in Nebraska, one in McCook, one in Alliance, one in Valentine, Scottsbluff, and Chadron. And what those bases do is fill up the aircraft with a liquid retardant that helps control the fire as it approaches those lines that they put in. We also have a mobile base that moves around the state depending on the next highest area of need, and 2 smaller bases that move around the state as well based on need. And then there's a trailer that moves retardant from one base to another. So as we look at last year, we had multiple times during the year where we had 5 aircraft. We had one time where we had 5 aircraft working out of the Valentine Seat Base, fighting a fire in the spring on the Halsey National Forest. If you're running that many aircraft through a base, we have about enough retardant for one operational day for that to keep those aircraft responding to the fire. So we have to move retardant between one base and another because it takes 3 or 4 days to actually get new shipments into the state. So we use our nurse trailers to move between bases and keep everybody supplied, and that's one of the reasons why we have the bases are scattered across the state. This aircraft here is a single engine aircraft, and you can see the orange retardant that they're dropping here. Last year we used about 144,000 gallons of the liquid concentrate. So if you're calculating that out on taking the concentrate and making what they drop here, you can multiply it by 8 or 10 and get how many gallons of retardant were dropped during the operational period. 4 times this year we were on fires that had 4 of these aircraft working as well, and those were in Valentine. They were over in Scottsbluff and Gering area. This last year we actually borrowed an aircraft from Kansas and had them up here for a while during the spring season when fires were in and around the Arapahoe area. So this past year, calendar year, we've so far had over 1,600 wildfires that were reported here in Nebraska, and that's going to equate to be more than 230,000 acres of land consumed during the wildfires, which will be the second most destructive year that we've had with wildfires in Nebraska. Some other programs that we have, and this isn't an all-inclusive list, but our conservation education program really looks to help connect youth with forestry and the values that we have around having trees in our communities and around our different areas. So our conservation education program goes into schools, works with educators, works with creating green spaces in and around, works with NSA to create those green spaces in and around schools. One of the things they found is when students have views of trees in their classrooms, they tend to have higher testing rates. So it definitely provides a benefit to us, and it may, frankly, it's our future leaders in natural resources. So making that connection now is pretty important. Another area that isn't forest, if you will, isn't defined as forest, is our windbreaks in our agroforestry systems. We have a lot of windbreaks and agroforestry systems in Nebraska. I think the number of windbreaks in linear miles is somewhere around 18,000 miles in Nebraska. These technically don't get defined as forest, but in Nebraska, they're a critical part of our green infrastructure. So whether it's a traditional windbreak in the upper left, or it's an agroforestry system where they're haying in between rows of nut producing hazelnuts, in that case, these are all part of the systems that we look at. And as we look at some of the other systems, we still look at traditional forest products. So whether it's a harvest and utilizing the trees, converting them into lumber and utilizing them in construction, kind of like the building up there in the top center, or it could be a house, or it could be a piece of furniture that happens to be made by a student at Lincoln High School that utilized some ash trees that were here in Lincoln. Or even thinking outside of the box and saying, okay, well, we're all familiar with using a fireplace to heat our homes or a wood stove to heat our homes. What if we were a larger scale than that? Similar to what they do in Chadron, where they heat and cool Chadron State College with wood waste. So what if we look out beyond that? What if there's smaller scale units, like in the lower right-hand side? This particular facility utilizes wood to run a kiln to dry their lumber. So, and then in the lower left, we're making biochar and utilizing that biochar in a agricultural setting and saying, okay, what if we add biochar to as a soil amendment to, it could even be in your garden, it could be in an agricultural field. What does that do to the productivity over time? So looking at different ways of using forest products, both traditional and non-traditional. And in our properties programs, we have 5 properties that we manage across the state, and those properties, we really use them to demonstrate, here's what can be done. If you have a, in this case, they're planting hazelnuts, but if you have a forest out there and you have emerald ash borer moving across the state, your forest is dominated by ash trees, what might you want to do? And our properties, we have different programs throughout the year and invite people out to see what we're doing on our properties. It's a really good way to kind of make that connection about between, okay, here's what you're describing to me, here's what it looks like. So we have those properties for those purposes. One of those is out in Cedar Canyon out by North Platte. The majority of them are here in the eastern part of the state. So as I talk to my fellow foresters across the country, they all envision Nebraska National Forest is looking like this. We have our one tree and we're really proud of our one tree. We all know that's not true. We know our forests look more like this. And that's true as we look all across our state. And really we're the crossroads for ecology in the United States when you look at your forests. We've got a lot of really cool things that happen here in Nebraska, and there's nobody else that can say that. You know, one thing I will tell you, managing trees and forests in Idaho is easy. You have 10 commercial species and you have lots of industry to help manage those forests. In Nebraska, it's not quite as easy, but it's cooler. So we've got a lot going for us as we look at our forests. And here in Nebraska, we got 1.56 million acres of forest land. And this is what we consider traditional forest land. It's inventoried, it's monitored as time goes on. And we have areas that are non-traditional forest or land with trees, as we call it. So our community forests, our windbreaks, our agroforestry systems. But as you look around the state, we start up in the upper left corner in the Pine Ridge area, you know, and look at that extent of ponderosa pine that we have here in Nebraska. It extends down the Niobrara Valley to the north central part of the state. And this is as far east as ponderosa pine naturally occurs. And it's the only place, like I said, and it's something that we're personally kind of proud of. The ponderosa pine forest makes up about 450,000 acres of our 1.56 million acres. And as we get into the Niobrara system, you start to see a blending of where east meets west. And we see remnants of the northern boreal forests where we find birch and aspen trees growing in this area, kind of up in the Chippewa County area, in that area. We see areas where oak meets ponderosa pine, and the eastern hardwood forest starts to tie in with that. We see influences where eastern red cedar, Rocky Mountain juniper start to mix into those types of forests. So really unique area of the state. As we move over to the Missouri River system, we start to see northeastern United States influences in our oak forests in there. We move down to the southeast part, we start seeing some of the southeastern parts of the United States. We're on the western extent of some of those species that show up there. And then as you look out of here in the southwest part of the state, we see the influences from the Great Plains and the eastern red cedar that creeps up into those areas. So let's drill down a little bit into those areas. So as you look at the purple here on the top left and into the center part of the state, that's where those ponderosa pine forests are. And as you get into the central part of the state, those boreal influences with aspen on the left and birch on the right on the top part of this photo, in that ecosystem, very, very unique. And as we look at the northwest corner of Nebraska and move to the west of those areas, we have our ponderosa pine, and we see Rocky Mountain juniper as an understory species in some of those forests. We see encroachment of eastern red cedar into some of the westernmost regions of those areas. We see eastern red cedar in the Niobrara Valley, and even up in the western part of the Panhandle, we have limber pine, and it's the furthest west that limber pine goes in the United States. So in these forests, we have our ponderosa pine overstory, and we have several deciduous species that are common in these areas, including green ash, American elm, and box elders. So a very, very interesting forest that's out there. We also have the largest human planted forest in the world, and that's out at Halsey Ranger District of the Nebraska National Forest. So right smack dab in the middle of Nebraska, we have a ponderosa pine forest, and we have red pine in there, and several other pine species in here. Here this last year, there were 2 fires up in the Halsey Ranger District. That, as you look at the lookout tower, unfortunately, we lost that during one of those fires. One of those fires, we also lost most of the 4-H camp that was out there in this forested area. But this is a really unique thing to Nebraska, and having this much planted forest out there, and really it is a test to see what kind of species could grow here. Started 100 years ago when they started this process to do this trial, and now with some of the fires, they may shift gears, and we might look at planting some other species that we want to try in the state and see how they do over a long period of time. As we continue our journey around Nebraska, we'll come over to the Missouri River Bluffs, and as I mentioned, the northeast part of the state is much different from the southeast part of the state. In the southeast part of the state, we start seeing some of the hickory show up in those forests. We see pawpaw in the understory of those forests. So we're getting that influence from the Missouri and southwest or southeast of us as we look at things. As we go to the north, we see more walnut showing up in the northeastern part of the state, and these tend to be oak savanna type forests. So very cool, a little bit more open in places, and we have different types of trees that show up, including butternut that's up there. Chinkapin oak is another one that typically shows up. Honey locust, hackberry, green ash, eastern red cedar is a common species up in these areas of the state. As we go west in these systems, we start seeing the oak species change, and we start looking at more bur oak showing up in the systems until we get out to McCook in the Republican, where it's primarily bur oak in some of those areas. So oak is a extremely important species for Nebraska, a genus for Nebraska, and we have it in a lot of different places, and it changes based on the different microclimates or climates that we have out across the state. And then we tie it all together. as we look across the state with our river systems, and up in the Niobrara, we talked about, and this picture shows some of the conifers mixed in with some of the hardwoods in that area. We have the Platte River, braided river system, where we have an elm ash cottonwood corridors. So those become the dominant species, and those change as we have the different parts of the state. But we also have willows that show up in those forests, and honey locusts that show up that are predominant up in the parts of the state too. So as we look at forests, and I've been in Wood River actually, and I had somebody at a filling station say, I had a Nebraska Forest Service shirt on, say, we have forests in Nebraska. And we just looked out across the interstate and said, yeah, that is forest, and spent a little time discussing our Nebraska forests. So we do have challenges that we have here in Nebraska that threaten our forests or compound some of the management issues that we have. And that ranges from wildfire. We all know that wildfire is a major influence, and often in Nebraska, our fires tend to be stand replacing fires, so they're intense. They grow through the canopy of the forest, and when the canopy burns, the ponderosa pine trees are dead, or they'll burn even the hardwoods down into the soil as well, so they kill the trees. Climate is an issue in Nebraska. We've seen the shift of hardiness zones to the north, and it used to be our division in Nebraska was just about on the interstate. It's now shifted to the north, to almost the South Dakota line. That's going to mean that different trees will grow in different areas, different species grow in different areas. Prescribed burning is a challenge too. So around prescribed burning, when is it appropriate? When's the right time to do it? When's the right areas to do it? What are the goals and objectives behind doing prescribed burning? Threatened and endangered species certainly influences some of the things that happen in Nebraska around our forests. One of the big issues that we currently are working through is the problem with white nose syndrome in our bats populations, and in particular the northern long-eared bat. The northern long-eared bat is due to be listed here probably around the 1st of February. There's some discussion whether they're going to move that back a little bit, but creates a challenge for when can we go in and do different management types out in forests, and not create a situation where we're creating additional issues for those animals that are on the threatened and endangered species list. So that creates policy issues around how we approach different things. And we'll work through all those. Those won't be a huge problem for us, but we'll have to step back and say, okay, what do we need to do differently from what we're currently doing? And in invasive species is always an issue for us as we look out across the state. We have invasive species, in the simplest term, emerald ash borer is an invasive species. It's creating all kinds of problems in our ash populations, but other invasive plants. And how do we manage those plants? I personally would consider Russian olive an invasive species. If you look out in the Platte River system, and in particularly in the North Platte River system and South Platte, Russian olive has escaped from different places that it was, and is becoming a very significant component of the riverbeds in those areas. So what do we do about those? How do we manage those? How do we help landowners manage those over time? And with our climate, we got our droughts, but we also have some intense storms. And in the center of the picture, there is a tree that was broken off at about 6 feet tall that was a wind-driven event. So we within our community forests, we'll have an ongoing challenge around these different events and how can we help communities better serve folks that live there. So I'd like to drill down just a little bit into fire because it's probably the most prominent issue. And here is a map of the Chadron area. So we're looking at the Pine Ridge area up in the northwest corner of the state. And some of the largest wildfires we've had have occurred up in this area. And like I said earlier, a lot of those fires are stand replacing fires when they burn through there, and they take out most, if not all, the trees when they burn. Over the last 20 years, we've been working a lot with our partners up there. And when I say partners, I mean landowners, I mean Game and Parks Commission here in Nebraska, I mean the U.S. Forest Service. And as you look at the map, the different colors there indicate the fuels projects that have been done up in that area. So as we look at the issues that we have with wildfire, generally wildfire is being pushed by a west to southwest wind in this area. It's being pushed towards communities. And just to give you an idea a little bit more, Crawford is probably 10 miles to the west off the map. Rushville is off to the east of the map. Alliance is probably 40 miles south of the area that the map covers. So anyway, as we look at this, there's two things that we're looking at. First, protection of property and lives, and that's the most important. So as we look at projects we do, how can we connect these projects with projects that the U.S. Forest Service is doing, or as we connect our projects to the U.S. Forest Service, how do we connect to projects that are done on the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission's properties? And we work on private lands alongside the landowners to make sure we're meeting their objectives. Game and Parks is probably working mostly on state lands, and U.S. Forest Service is working primarily on federal lands. So we're looking at cross boundaries as we look at this and trying to connect all these pieces to protect the community, protect people, protect property. And we're also looking at the green islands of trees that are left up there and trying to protect those as well, make them more resilient to a future wildfire. And one of the reasons we are doing this is we look at these fires that are burning, it's often decades before you start seeing natural regeneration in these areas. So new pine trees coming in to replace the old pine trees. And part of that is because the distance between live trees can be a long ways. So we're relying on birds to help spread that seed across the landscape, or we're relying on pine cones falling in the right areas where there are live trees to help spread or repopulate those pine trees. And we just have large areas that are out there that don't have trees. And so what we've done here is we've hired a professional planting crew to come in and do reforestation efforts up in that country. And we're trying to look at blocks of land that are absent of ponderosa pine trees and saying, how can we go in there, plant trees in the right area? So we're mostly looking at east aspects and north aspects, and it's because they're a little bit cooler and a little bit wetter, and plant trees in areas that we can start to the process of reforesting these areas. And today we have about 525,000 trees that have been planted up in the Niobrara and up in the Pine Ridge to do this. It's been pretty successful in some areas I've looked at for survival. We're probably running about 90% survival in those areas, which is outstanding for a planting program of this type. And we will continue to do this as long as we can continue to get grants that allow us to do this, and we have landowners that are interested in working on this. So I know we have funding for probably another 4 years, and we'll look for funding for year 5 and beyond as we do this. This is what they call Sea Hill for those folks that aren't familiar with it, but this is just outside of the community of Chadron. And this is one of the reasons that we need to be thinking about how we connect all those projects together to protect the community. This is from 2006, where this fire burned into the edge of Chadron, Nebraska. And this is a practice football field right here, and in the middle of the picture on the right. And the area you see smoking is the wood chip pile that they use to heat and cool the facilities there. So this fire pushed very hard on the community, lots of risk to the community. And there were times where this community was evacuated and they didn't really know if they were going to be able to stop it, thanks to some of the green space associated with the school and some hardscape that's associated with it, stopped at the edge of the community. But when we're looking at projects and looking at how we approach those fuels projects, this is one of the reasons we do this, is to not let it burn into communities in the future. So here are a couple different forest types that we see across Nebraska. The upper left is a cedar stand that's up in northeast Nebraska. And what we've done in this circumstance is we've gone in there and we've created field breaks. It's a cedar stand that has some hardwood forest in it, but it's primarily eastern red cedar. And as we look at the back part of that picture behind the person that's standing there, that trail's about 66 feet wide. And the idea behind it is, if there's a fire here, let's get that fire to the ground and be able to stop it at the ridge, rather than have a canopy fire that firefighters can't go in here ahead of this fire and be at risk. The lower left is a stand up in the Niobrara area, where this is a hardwood forest, oak dominated stand that did have a cedar understory. And we've gone in there and thinned those trees out, and we've created a situation where the hardwood stands there, the fuels have been shipped and left in place to recycle some of the nutrients that are associated with it. And that stand is less at risk for lots of things, fire and insects and everything else that could happen. The right-hand photo is up in the Pine Ridge. It's an area where we've gone in and thinned out what we call ladder fuels. So the fuels that are on the ground, grasses and forbs that would carry a fire during a dry season, would go into small trees that then carries the fire up into the canopy of those pine trees. And once it's in the canopy, especially when it's wind driven, becomes extremely hard to fight. So we've gone in here and thinned this out. They haven't taken care of the small trees that have been cut down at this point, but they will before they leave this particular project. This project happens to be one that was done as a collaboration between the U.S. Forest Service and the Nebraska Forest Service. So worked on the federal side of the landscape, worked on the private side of the landscape. It didn't quite ignore the fence, but we sort of ignored the fence, where the federal side of the project was funded by the U.S. Forest Service. The private side of the project was funded by us and the landowner. So we did a cost share program with the landowner to make the impact of that activity greater. So looking at the cedar situation here in Nebraska, and I think we all know that eastern red cedar it is a tree that has to be managed. And if we go back to 1952, this is in Les Canyons, so south of North Platte. This property looked like that. You can see on the south and some of the west aspects, there are cedar trees shown by the texture here. A little bit on the east aspects, but mostly rangeland that was out there. If we jump ahead 40 years into 1993, that area, those cedars are much more dense. Many more areas are occupied by eastern red cedar. And as we jump ahead to 2010, we see even more cedar trees showing up. The cedar population in the state probably peaked around 2015. Since then, we've seen the actual inventory of those trees decline. It's not declining fast, but a lot of it's due to the activities of land managers out there recognizing, hey, we need to manage this tree if we're going to do that. And that can be done through lots of different ways. You know, there's cost share programs that help landowners do this. It could be a prescribed burn that is done as one of those cost share activities. It could be mechanical treatments, or it could be somebody out with their loppers when they see small trees showing up in their pasture in an area that they didn't want. But between 2005 and 2010, we were seeing an increase of acres of cedar trees by about 38,000 acres per year. That has plateaued and started down. So we see that as a positive direction. It is a native species, so by definition, it's not invasive, but it is a tree that absolutely has to be managed if we're going to have it across the landscapes and meet goals and objectives of our landowners. And here's another stand where you start to see that cedar encroaching into a ponderosa pine stand here. And when I talk about ladder fields, you can imagine how a fire could easily go from the ground into the small cedar trees, into the tops of the pine trees, and especially if there's wind behind it, and become a stand replacing fire. So this becomes an area that we really focus in on and try to help landowners with the management. And over the past several years, we look at acres treated here in Nebraska, and we refer to it as hazardous fields reduction, and part of that's driven by the names behind the federal grants that we work under. But in 2002, the U.S. Forest Service created a grant program along with the state foresters and said, you know, we need to have a program to start to treat acres before they burn, rather than try to fight fire when things are in the worst conditions that they could be. So the grant program looked at going in and doing these treatments ahead of the fire, helping landowners do this. Right now we have 9 grants that are open and associated with reducing the field per acre. In those grants, there's all of our dollars are obligated to projects, and we'll continue to work through those projects. We have 10 new grants that have been submitted for all corners of the state, and one of the requirements is we have a community wildfire protection plan for each county that wants to participate, and that plan has to be up to date, so less than 10 years old. I will tell you that Nebraska's community wildfire protection plans, 92 of our 93 counties are up to date. So we qualify, most of our counties qualify for working with these types of grants. If people are interested, they can just reach out to us and go forward. So with that, I guess I would like to open it up to questions and see what might be out there. I hope you found this interesting, and I'd be happy to answer a few questions. My contact information is there, and feel free to reach out to me anytime, or visit us at our website, which is nfs.unl.edu. and feel free to reach out to us. So, Michelle, what kind of questions?
Yeah. Well, thank you. That was really interesting. I feel like I learned a lot, and it's clear there are a lot of moving parts and pieces and lots of effort going into maintaining and managing and growing our forest. So thank you for that. We do have some questions in the chat. So we have a few minutes to get to those. I know you touched a little bit on controlled burns and hear me still? My computer seems to be buffering. Uh-oh.
You're still here, Michelle.
Oh, I'm still here. Yeah, my computer was buffering. Sorry.
Yeah.
It keeps telling me it quit unexpectedly, but miraculously.
Here, I can ask the question if you'd like
Okay.
about that. Okay, so yeah, one of the questions early on from Ken asked, with some of the prairie environments that require fire to remain healthy, are there any programs that encourage controlled burns? And are the aircraft you discussed, the seat bases, on standby for those events?
Yeah, so the last part of that question around the single engine air tankers is those air tankers come on in usually June, maybe July, depending on the circumstances and what precipitation has been for the year. And they stay on until roughly the minimum of a 60-day contract, and can be on for much longer than that, but often into October is when we have those aircraft here. Last year we had it on from April 30th through almost November 1st. So, and we had 2 aircraft on. So those aircraft are not usually available, but what is available through in the event of a escape fire is we do have a program around our aerial applicators where we have contracts with them to help us in events of wildfires, and we do call them in and ask them to help us when those circumstances happen. As far as prescribed burning goes in rangelands and prairie settings, prescribed burning is a wonderful tool. It has to be done at the right time, the right place, so we don't have problems. And there are some programs that are put together. Prescribed burning, I believe, is a practice that's available through NRCS programs, some of their programs. Nebraska Game and Parks has some programs. The state is looking at right now having potentially a program where trained state staff and equipment could be called upon in the future. It all depends on what the unicameral does, but could be called upon in the future to come out and help. Beyond that, there's also training that's provided by Nebraska Forest Service, Nature Conservancy, Pheasants Forever is another one that provides some training to help people develop burn plans and pull together prescribed burns in different areas.
Excellent. I think Michelle's back, so I'll turn it back. Oh, she doesn't have access to the chat. So
My chat disappeared. I don't know what's happening over here. Systemic breakdown. So thank you for
Yeah,
getting
no
to the
problem.
chat questions.
So Austin asked, where are some of your favorite or most unique forest areas in Nebraska, and can the public visit them?
And my favorite forest in Nebraska is honestly the Pine Ridge, and I'm completely biased, so accept that. But you can access those forests. Fort Robinson has some of those forests. And if you're into hiking, you can go back into the wilderness area behind that forest or behind the fort to see some of those areas. You can go to Shattern. Shattern State Park is an area that has that forest. And then on the hardwood side, I love bur oak. And there's nothing more cool to me than a bur oak tree, especially one that's been around for a while. And areas in and around McCook are some really cool areas to go see some really neat bur oak trees. So we do have access to a lot of these types of areas. If you need any help finding them, we probably could help you out there with that too. Just holler at us.
Great. Do you have any evergreen trees to recommend planting in Lancaster County?
Okay, I'm going to go back to my favorite, and it's in. I have 5 of them in my yard. I love Douglas fir, and that's probably the leftover 25 years of working in Idaho that leads me to say that. But Douglas fir is such a pretty tree, and it grows in Lancaster County. Trick is to get one that will grow here, because you can find some that won't. And the inland version of Douglas fir, it's Pseudotsuga menziesii incana, is a species that will grow in Nebraska. Don't get the coastal Douglas fir, because they will not make it. But there are several nurseries around that have them. I get my little seedlings from the University of Idaho, and it's by far my favorite evergreen. It's not native, and I know that, but it's
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, Johanna would like to know, what tools or tactics do you recommend utilizing when working with trees in a curated area, such as a city park? It's a broad question. So I guess, Johanna, if you have more focused, maybe feel free to put that in the chat.
And Joanna, if you would like to add to that in the chat, please feel free to. I'll start out. I think diversity is key. And when we plant parks, when we plan our parks, when we grow our parks, I think we need to be thinking about that diversity and do our best to share those planting sites with different species. And I think that applies really honestly in every one of our planting environments where we have options and can plant different species. It definitely doesn't put us in a situation like we're going to see here over the next few years, where some of our parks are almost all ash, and those parks are going to look vastly different here in the next several years as emerald ash borer comes through, and city folks have to address those trees that are going to be dying in the next several years.
Okay, just 2 more questions we got for you.
Okay.
Are there any native trees listed as Tier 1 or Tier 2 species of concern in Nebraska's Natural Legacy Project?
Teresa, I'd have to go back and look at the list. I don't know off the top of my head. And
yeah, and that's fine. That's fine, John, because I couldn't come up with any either. That's why I asked the question, but I figured there's probably an oak or 2 on the list, but yeah.
Yeah, so now I have homework, and I will go back and look.
Thank you.
So thank you for the question.
And finally, Kathleen asks, has any sign of bur oak blight shown up in Nebraska?
I don't believe so. I don't think we have that issue yet. And I know our forest health folks are watching closely.
Okay. I think that's all the questions. So I'll turn it back over to you. Oh.
Question, and I'm sorry, I just figured out where the chat thing is. So I was wondering about the response for the fire at Halsey.
Mhm.
I'm from that area, and when I was home last time, one of the things I heard was that there were a lot of local fire volunteer units that showed up, but they were kept out from helping with that fire. And then, of course, it leaped across Highway 2 and then practically burned all of one new place that was recently sold, and it caused a lot of damage. So can you give me the reasoning for why you wouldn't want local help to help locally?
Uh, So it's federal land up there that was on fire. So it had federal control on that fire. So what they did is, and I can't speak specifically to departments showing up and not being allowed to assist. That's the U.S. Forest Service. But generally speaking, I can speak in general terms. A federal fire starts on federal land. The U.S. Forest Service has management control over that fire. And as a general rule, they're going to look for resources that are trained in the same way they are and have those credentials, but also have the equipment to communicate. So radios, for instance, that are in a volunteer fire department might not be adequate to communicate over the federal systems that are there. And I don't know if they were or they weren't in this particular case. I do know that when it crossed Highway 20, it became a joint command at that or across Highway 2. I mean, it became joint command. The local resources worked on the north side of the highway, and the U.S. Forest Service maintained control of the south part of the highway. To get a more specific answer to that, I would suggest you reach out to Julie Bain and ask her what the circumstances were. And she's the district ranger in the area. The fire did transition over to a incident management team that was national, and that happened a few days, probably a couple days into the incident. It may have been faster than that, but it did transition to a national team that took over control of the fire. And at that point, it becomes under that team's authority. So they manage the fire at that point.
Okay, thank you for your explanation, and I really enjoyed your program, and I can see we have a lot of work to do to work together better. Because, I don't know how much federal response you're going to get out there and on short notice. So we need to definitely update our communication abilities.
Yeah, and a lot of the resources that came in, the single engine air tankers were something that they're a state asset that was used on that. The feds paid for that. The large aircraft that were working that fire were federal assets that they ordered in as part of that effort. But you're right, there's opportunity to improve. And I think as the U.S. Forest Service and the state of Nebraska and the volunteer fire departments all work more together, I think it was probably smoother than it was in 2012. I think there was a lot of issues then, but I think there's been improvement. There's always more room for improvement, and yeah, so there's opportunity there for sure.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, John, for taking the time with us this afternoon. And thanks everyone for attending. We appreciate it. We have 2 more winter plant talks in February, one on the 9th and the 23rd. So if you're not registered for those, you can do that at plantnebraska.org/events. And we hope to see you then. So thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.